The next task that we're going to look at under the Persistent Connection API is the onConnected async. This task is called when a new connection is made. So here's our user with the client side, makes a request to the server side, thus instantiating a new connection, and then that fires the onConnected async method task. Here's an example of the code. Here we have a task for the onConnected async, receives an iRequest and the connection ID. All we're returning here is a broadcast message saying that the connection was made, but you could obviously fire off other methods or procedures that need to be done when a new client connection is made to your application. So let's look into Visual Studio and see how this is done. Okay, so now back in Visual Studio, what I need you to do is go into your Solution Explorer, into the con folder you made in the previous example, and open up My Endpoint. And right after we instantiate the My Endpoint class, go ahead and make a new line or two. And we're going to be doing the onConnected async task. So we're going to say protected, override, type in task, and this is onConnected, which it puts it in there. Okay, got 11 IntelliSense. So let's remove where it says return base yada yada, put in return connection dot broadcast, and here I'm going to put in a span with a style for color red, so we can see when people make connections very easily in our message list. I'm going to say connection, space, we'll put in the connection ID that we're getting passed, and we'll just say connected, and then end our little span tag that we're doing there, print C, and end the line. Okay, so now if we've written this correctly, what it's going to do is when the event onConnected async runs, it's going to broadcast a message back to the UI and add to our unordered list this data that we're passing back. So let's go ahead and save this, and we will hit Control F5, and then we'll open up our browser window here and click on our Persistent Connection API so we can go to that page, and here you see it's already worked. Here it says that this connection has been made, and this is my GUID of my connection ID. So just to make sure the other part still works, and there it is. So the data has been received. Now let's see how this would kind of work more in a real environment where you could see people popping on and off. So let's go ahead and open up Internet Explorer and Google Chrome. Okay. Wait, I don't want to sign into Chrome. I don't need to, so I'm going to copy my URL out of my one web browser and put it in the other. Okay. So what you can see here is now that Google Chrome came on second and Internet Explorer came on third. So what you can see is when those connections were actually made. If you look over here in Firefox on the right side, you see that this was the first one, and it identified Firefox when it first came on, made the connection. I pushed a piece of data out, which was test, and then Google Chrome came on, which that's this connection here, and lastly Internet Explorer came online and got assigned a connection. So because Internet Explorer was last, it doesn't have any idea that the other two guys are online right now. Chrome knows about Internet Explorer but does not know about the Firefox. So it is in order that way. So if I push out another test out of Firefox, now both Chrome and Internet Explorer know that there's a third connection from Firefox that was there previously. So this has been an example of the onConnected async task, and how to use it. The next task that we're going to look at is the onReconnected async task. This is called when a connection is restored to your web application. Here we have a user who has lost connection to the site for whatever reason. Their client side, which is trying to reestablish a connection, is making a request to the server side. So the server side says, hey, you already have a connection, but I lost you, so now you're back. So I'm going to fire the onReconnected async task and do whatever I need to do, and then I'm going to pass you back a message saying you're all good. So here's an example of the overriding of the task for onReconnected async that we're doing. As you can see, we are requesting the request, any groups that the connection may be a part of, and the actual client ID that is just a string for this particular connection. And simply we're returning a connection.broadcast message that goes out to everybody that has a connection to the web application saying client with the client ID has reconnected. So let's look into Visual Studio and see how this is done. The next task that we're going to look at is the onReconnected async task. So in Visual Studio, go ahead and open up your MyEndpoint class, which we have here. And after the task of onConnected async, let's make a new line. And we're just going to type in protected, override, task, onReconnected, and let it fill in there. And then basically we want to remove the base onReconnected async. And we'll just do connection.broadcast reconnected connection. Scroll over a little bit here. Just put connection ID. And actually we'll just leave it at that. Okay. It's pretty straightforward. Essentially what we're doing here is we're establishing a task for SignalR saying on reconnection broadcast this message right here to everyone. So let's go ahead and hit save and Control F5, and that will pop open your browser with the MVC site, and go to your persist connection page, type in test. Okay, everything's still working. Now let's try to keep doing a little pulse here. Okay, and let us go down to go close the browser and try to reopen it. Now sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Essentially what really needs to take place is a closed connection in the back end from the server itself. So let's go ahead and hit Control F5 again, launch our page open here. So this will probably just say connected. Yeah, just this regular connection is connected. And so the way onReconnected async works is when you force it from the server side to be disconnected, but the idea is that it'll fire this event and say reconnection is there. But more times than not, you will actually run into situations where it'll establish a new connection and not fire the onReconnected unless it is terminated from the server side. So this has been an example of how to set up onReconnected async so that it'll be available in your web app. The next task we're going to talk about is the onDisconnect async task. This is called when a connection goes away. Basically the client is no longer connected, like a browser closing or what have you. So here we have our user with their client side making a request to the server and then back, so it's being happy, and then we have another user also doing the same thing, receiving broadcast messages from their connection, and we have a third user also receiving broadcast messages from the server. So say our main user goes away. Well, what happens is that the onDisconnect async fires, and then the server side notifies the clients that have remaining connections. Here's an example of the code that goes along with this. Here's the onDisconnect async task, and we're passing in a connection ID of the one that's being disconnected. And here we simply return a broadcast message of saying the connection with that connection ID disconnected. So let's look into Visual Studio and see how this is done. The next task of the persistent connection that we're going to look at is the onDisconnect async task. So in your MyEndpoint C# class, let's go ahead and make a new line, and we're going to say protected override task onDisconnect, and let the IntelliSense put the rest there. Again, remove the base, and what we're going to say here is connection.broadcast. And here, let's do another span and do a style. I'll say I'll say color blue for disconnection, and we're going to say connection ID is disconnected. So we just want to pass this message to everybody in the system that this connection has been disconnected right now. Okay, pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and save it and hit Control F5. Close that other window. Okay, go to Persistent Connection API. Okay, that's working. Let's just move this Firefox window over, and let's go ahead and open up Google Chrome, and we'll paste over says that it's connected over here. So now if we also open up Internet Explorer, we'll paste the same message, or the same URL, excuse me, and we'll go there. Okay, now we got that connection. So now if I close Internet Explorer, we see a disconnection message on both Google Chrome and Firefox. So this has been an example of how to use the onDisconnect async task within SignalR. The next task that we're going to cover is the onError async task. This is called when an error occurs on the connection. So here we have our user, client side, making a request to the server, server side gets it, responds, and back to the client side. Well, let's say something happens on the client side and then also trickles to the connection, and then the server has to respond, and it responds with a broadcast message of saying an error had occurred. And that would go out to all the users that currently had a connection to your web application. So here is the method task that traps the error and the exception. So here we are simply returning a connection.broadcast that's saying an error occurred and then passing what the exception actually was. So let's look into Visual Studio and see how this is done. Okay, in Visual Studio, this is what we're going to look at now, is the onError async task. And this is a handy little task that you kind of want in place basically to capture any errors that may occur within SignalR. Hopefully it's something that doesn't get used very often, but at least it'll be in place to do logging for you or whatever else you want to hook up to it. So this is pretty much what we do. Make yourself a new line in the MyEndpoint CS file. Protected, override, task, onError async. That already knows what we want to do, because that's the only one that we're missing. And where it says return base, take out the base part, and we're going to say connection dot broadcast we'll also put in a span. So style equals color. I know we did red before, but we'll put red again. Close that and say error occurred. Do that, and we'll go pass the error in. Okay, and just save it. And I'm not going to Control F5 because I don't have any errors as we have now. But this is pretty much the task that you want in place. You know, you could do something like if you had like inlog set up and it was set to like logger, you could do logger.log. Error on page, you know, and then pass the error tag, you know, something along those lines. You know, you've got quite a bit of options that you can do here using the on-error async task.